Good morning, all. I hope you and your families are all safe and well today. And I'd like to introduce myself. I'm James. I'm a senior manager at Cooper Parry, and today we are bringing you our webinar, which is Learning Lessons, Staying Compliant and Forward Thinking. This is in association with the Institute of School and Business Leaders, ISBL, who have put this on as part of their Expert Talks program. And we're hoping to have lots of great insight for you today in a bit of an old school chat conversation webinar where there will thankfully be no slide deck. I have just realised that there is a light fitting above my head, but unfortunately there will be no light bulb moments from this part of the webinar. However, I do have three very esteemed guests who will be able to talk to you through three key learnings that we're hoping to get from today. And this will be really to jargon bust a lot of the financial sort of COVID-19 guidance that is out and about at the moment, looking at what effective governance looks like as part of sort of the education sector, specifically the academies, and a practical example about what that's like to actually work through on day-to-day life. And finally, but by no means least, we have then a look at sort of the risk management, internal scrutiny, and all of the things around sort of the operational day-to-day parts of being a school business manager or FD during these times. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to one of my panelists, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves in their own right. And the first thing we want to look at is sort of those key financial issues that have been brought about in this COVID-19 guidance. But first of all, I would like to bring Andy Jones to discuss what those key things are.
Great, thanks, James. Morning, everyone. I hope you're all well. So yeah, I guess just introducing myself, my name's Andy Jones, so I'm a relationship director at Cooper Parry. So I get involved in audit, accounting, assurance, a whole range of sort of financial advice, governance advice for schools and academies. I'm also a charity trustee and a trustee of a school, so grappling with a lot of the issues you're no doubt grappling with today as well. The first thing I wanted to talk about was just the financial. I mean, there's loads of guidance out there, you know, staggering and across all sorts of facets, and even more coming out on a daily basis. But what I really wanted to look at was just in terms of all that financial guidance. And for me, there's kind of been two key aspects to the financial guidance. One is about what financial support is there for schools and academies. And that comes down to things like, you know, the exceptional costs funding under the coronavirus job retention scheme. Because for schools and academies, it is a little bit different to everyone else because the core funding from the government is continuing. So the avenues are a little more limited, but there is some scope there for additional support and funding. So that's been key. And also how schools should approach dealing with and paying suppliers during the crisis as well. And the other aspect of the guidance that I think is quite key, or not quite key, very key, is around financial management and regulatory management. And that's really, I think, set out by the letter that Eileen Milner issued quite recently, where she talked about a lot of things, or covered a lot of things, you know, deferral of some of the financial returns and things. But I think what was quite key in that letter was the focus on the Academy's financial handbook and how important it was during this period that, you know, financial governance and financial management, you know, the schools still had to maintain, you know, very strong, effective financial management and governance, and that the SFA weren't looking at any relaxation of any of the requirements under the handbook. And actually emphasising that, you know, now management teams, boards should be really focusing on the key aspects of the handbook and making sure they continue to comply with that through the whole period. So for me, those have been the two key aspects from a financial management and regulatory aspect that's come out of the guidance so far.
That's fantastic. So we'll cover off both of those aspects as we go along. But it'd be great, first of all, to introduce Sarah and just really to get that introduction and looking at sort of the financial controls and risk management, and just how that second part of Andy's summary there is really affecting sort of the boots on the ground.
Hi everybody. My name's Sarah Chambers. I'm a senior manager at Cooper Parry. I do a lot of work on internal scrutiny. I'm a chartered accountant, but I also worked in school for 6.5 years as a business manager. So I've kind of got a bit of a foot in both camps from that point of view. And also I'm a governor at a maintained primary school. So we're also currently going through a lot of the sort of risk management planning for reopening and that kind of thing. So I think just to pick up on what Andy was saying, absolutely, it's really important that although we're all working in kind of changed circumstances, the expectations around governance, controls, all of that kind of thing haven't really changed. So we might have to do things a bit differently, but we still have to do them. And we've had quite a few questions from clients around kind of internal scrutiny and, does this mean that we don't have to do it anymore, or, can we stop doing some of the things we're doing? And ultimately the answer we've been giving them is no. We still have to do it, but as a firm we've been working closely with clients to make sure that we can still support them in this sort of new remote working world. So we have still managed to do internal scrutiny. What we've done sometimes looked a little bit different, but ultimately we've managed to meet that compliance need and to give the trustees the reassurance that they need on meeting those requirements.
And how does that then work in terms of some of the financial reporting that the schools have to do in this sort of segment of the school year? So there's obviously been some talk about the BFRO and budgets and things which are quite pertinent at the moment. So what, from talking to your contacts and your experience, what would people still be needing to focus on at around this time?
Okay, so the BFRO has been cancelled, and that so that's one less job, I guess, for business managers to do in terms of submitting it. But actually, at the end of the day, that doesn't really take away the need to be doing the forecasting. The forecasting kind of still needs to happen. If anything, I'd say it's more important than it ever was, really, because everything's looking so different. When we were 6 months ago, we weren't really anticipating schools closing, and a lot of schools have lost a lot of income streams, lettings and after school clubs, and so that's having quite an impact on their kind of year-end outturn. So if anything, I'd be encouraging schools to invest the time maybe that's been saved by filling in DFE forms to make sure they've got a really robust plan. We've also had a few questions from clients about the budget forecast return and is that going to be cancelled? I think it's highly unlikely it'll be cancelled. We don't have any indication of that at this point. And schools, in any case, it's good financial management to be preparing budgets and forecasts. And I'd encourage everybody to continue with that at this point.
Yeah. And is there anything else around sort of the reporting deadlines or anything like that we need to be aware of at this time?
Not at this point. No, we don't have any news that anything has changed on budget forecast return. The budget forecast that's due in July, we're still expecting it to be July. And in terms of kind of year-end audit and that kind of thing, we're not anticipating at this point any changes.
Brilliant.
Unfortunately, so it's been a tight turnaround.
And just in terms of the budgets, obviously in the uncertain times that we are in at the moment, have you had any indications of likely assumptions or things that would be put into those budgets to deal with the environment that we're in, or is this still sort of on a case-by-case basis?
I think for the kind of the core activities of the schools, in terms of funding, we're not particularly expecting to see anything different in terms of pay awards. That's all been quite widely trailed in the media about, you know, teacher pay awards and kind of what the likely outcome is on support staff. So really it starts to be looking around, I think from a budgeting perspective, whether the current circumstances change our school improvement plan and therefore whether that changes our budget. So if we have, for example, you know, a different method of delivering lessons next year, does that impact our staffing? If we have, you know, more kind of emotional needs in the classroom, do we need more support staff to meet those needs? And you know, that's probably the biggest impact rather than the sort of funding, staff costs. And I guess, you know, that, you know, there might be, after you've done the staffing, you know, there might be kind of other premises impacts because we're using our premises potentially in a slightly different way. But really it comes back to looking at your school development plan or your trust plan for how you're delivering your school improvement, and then fitting that into a budget, you know, that explains all of that.
That's fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it'd be a great point now just to hand over to Simon, just in terms of the reporting requirements and the measures brought in by the COVID guidance, and just how that affects sort of a multi-academy trust in sort of reality, really.
Thanks, James. Morning, everybody. I'm Simon. I'm a partner here at Cooper Parry, and I lead the not-for-profit team, so spend most of my working life advising academies and educational establishments. But in my spare time, I chair the board of a 17-school multi-academy trust, community academies trust. So what we thought would be useful today would be to share a little bit of insight as to what I've been doing in my role of chair, actually, as we've navigated COVID-19 and all the myriad of challenges that have been thrown at us as both trustees, but also at our very resilient and extremely resourceful staff complement, actually, that have been working through this. So I think just to pick up on James's question there and Sarah's points, at Community Academies Trust, from a financial perspective, we very much try to keep things on an even footing in terms of business as usual. So we've made some extensive use of technology, Microsoft Teams being the main one, to make sure that across all of our schools, budget monitoring has continued as we would expect. And interestingly, I think like lots of organisations, the feedback that's come back has been, can we carry on working like this when we get out of the situation that we're in into the new norm? I think people have really valued the ability to jump on a Teams call, to share screens and to work through issues with colleagues in our central team. In terms of budgets and forecasts, we very much now started to turn our attentions, particularly as an audit committee, to what the year-end outturn is going to look like in terms of some sensitivity analysis that we're applying to our forecasts and budgets. So we've kind of taken our initial plans and overlaid the main impact of COVID on this, which, as Sarah has said, for the academy and maintain sector, funding has pretty much continued as normal. GAG funding's coming in, other pockets of funding is coming in. The main thing that we're having to grapple with at the moment is a fall in earned income. So we've done some real sensitivity around our lettings income, our catering income, and the main one for us is a complete fall off of leisure facilities. So one of our secondary schools has got a community leisure facility with a swimming pool in it, which obviously has been completely closed. So we've now been modelling what that looks like in terms of a drop off of income, and what that means for that individual school's budget, and whether we need to think a little bit differently about how we account for and deal with that hole really that's been left for that school. You know, the beauty and the strength of being a 17-school MAT is that we have reserves around the trust that we can utilise and help our other colleagues and our other schools with. So we're currently looking at that really in terms of that real sensitivity analysis and how one school can perhaps help the other through this period of crises.
Fantastic, thanks, Simon. And before we bring sort of this section to a close, we've had a question that's come through the chat. I think it's just a great sort of point just to say, as we go through the webinar, if you want to ask any questions, please do not hesitate, and we can either find a suitable slot as we're chatting through these things, or have a full sort of Q&A at the end of the session. But this particular question was just on extended care income, and obviously that through the things that are happening with parents not commuting and things like that, and operating without those extended care services, is just how we think that might impact on things sort of going forward. So I don't know, Andy, whether this would be one for you to pick up, and then Sarah, just to get your thoughts thereafter. And actually, I mean, this may actually just be a good.
Yeah, that's fine, James. I mean,
other income streams such as unspent free school meals, unspent PE grants, and all things like that, because there's a lot going on with income, and we may just be able to just wrap that up in one answer.
well, I think it comes back to your scenario planning. Absolutely. If you're seeing it, and it's all about just that wider thinking. Well, if this is what we're seeing, so what might the future look like as we come back in September? So if aftercare activities are going to drop off, because like the questioner said, more people are going to be thinking, well, I'll just deal with that from home. So it's scenario planning. What's the income impact, but also therefore what actions may we have to take from a cost perspective to deal with that income. For me, that's the key, and it's all those, putting all of those scenarios into the pot in terms of, how to deal with that, what actions you can take with it.
Yeah. I mean, I'd absolutely agree with that. I guess we're talking about primary, because that. So for extended services, the wraparound care and that kind of thing, yes, it could have a really significant impact. I think it's really hard to say at this point. Personally, I've got a child who's in primary, and I'm really missing him having the wraparound care, because it means like, I work from home most of the time actually, but I still need the wraparound care. So I wouldn't have thought it necessarily personally means that you'll have a massive drop off, because parents will probably still need the care. It would be more about whether the school feels capable of providing the care, the wraparound services. I know, the school where I'm a governor, we've had to look very carefully at a wraparound, and whether we can still continue to provide that. So like Andy says, it really comes back to kind of thinking through what the likely options are, and maybe running a few scenarios and kind of thinking, trying to get some kind of, it's only a plan, it's only a budget, but trying to get some kind of best guess of where things might be. And then once you've got that plan, things will change inevitably, but that you've got somewhere to work from as a starting point. It's difficult at the moment. It's really difficult. There's so many unknowns.
And I think with that scenario plan, what it lets you look at is you say, well, actually, our aftercare income, just using that as the example, our aftercare income might be slow to take up. So, but if that's the case, we still need to keep our staffing structure in place for that aftercare and our other costs in place. So how does our financial plan look like in light of that? Because we're thinking, it may take a little bit of time for a little bit of sort of nervousness in the community to disappear, hopefully, and that we get a bit more take up. So in the meantime, can we absorb those costs? Can we cover it anyway from the rest of our budget?
That's brilliant. And I think just to add to that, because I'm in a slightly different scenario insofar as my little girl won't be going to primary school for another couple of years, but certainly with the nurseries, there's been lots of sort of surveys and things sent out well in advance of sort of the 1st of June when nurseries will be going back, just to really get that appetite of will you be looking to come back on the 1st of June, what sort of your main concerns and things. And again, sort of trying to do all of that upfront work just may assist your scenario planning and get a narrower sort of scenario of what that income sort of may look like, and then as Andy and Sarah sort of both point out there, sort of what that cost structure associated with the income then looks like. But that's a great question. Thank you very much for that. And I think just to wrap up sort of then that part of the webinar, obviously we've mentioned sort of the two main aspects to the COVID governance, and we've just then sort of picked apart a little bit about what the reporting and the risk management looks like around COVID-19 and what we're all trying to do around the day-to-day. So in terms of just going back to those sort of three key learnings, we've sort of gone halfway through the COVID-19. We've looked at a little bit of risk management, and we've touched on a tiny little bit of governance, all of which we will come back to now. But I'd like to sort of go back to Andy and really sort of understand a little more about sort of the financial support aspects of sort of the COVID-19 governance and what is actually out there for the schools and academies to sort of obtain from the government.
Thanks, James. So, I think the two key ones out there, because as I said at the beginning, the funding's continued, or the core funding continues. So the two main avenues that have been announced is obviously the exceptional cost funding. So that is one that's available for academies or schools and academies to access for any exceptional costs that they've incurred in some specific areas, and that's in terms of increased premises costs, costs of providing free school meals, which are over and above the national voucher scheme, and also additional cleaning costs. Now, and this is probably one where we've had quite a few questions, and it's one we've dealt with at the school where I'm a trustee as well directly, because the issue we had is the national voucher scheme has been really hard to implement for us because of where we are. We're quite a rural school, and the demographics of our free school meals pupils. So we've had to source our own alternatives. We haven't really been able to use the national scheme. So we've completely documented why we weren't able to do it, what the additional considerations were, what are the other sources we've utilised, and the costs associated with that, so that hopefully when some more details on the exceptional costs funding comes out, and the mechanism for claiming that, we will be able to reclaim those costs. I think one thing on the exceptional costs funding to add as well, because it's where I've had a couple of questions from clients, and particularly Matt's, is about the fact that with that funding you're not able to claim it if you're expecting to add to your reserves during the 2020-21 financial year. So reasonably straightforward on the face of it, but for a MAT, is that at the MAT level or is it an individual school level? And we've asked this question directly of the SFA, and they've clarified that it is at an individual school level. So even if as a MAT you're expecting to add to your reserves, and most of your schools are adding to their reserves, but you do have one school or a couple of schools at the MAT that aren't expecting to add to their reserves and have incurred those exceptional costs, then they're completely eligible to claim the funding for those costs. So I think that's a good and the right solution for MATs as well. The other area where there's funding available is in terms of the coronavirus job retention scheme. It's a bit of a mouthful, CJRS for short. And again, I think this is probably one where we've had a lot of questions from clients, and there's some of the questions have been around some of the moral obligations here of furloughing, not furloughing staff. But then also, the real practicalities of it is that, well, actually, although schools and academies, you are receiving the majority of the core fund, or receiving all the core funding, there are some traded income streams, and the staff that operate in those areas aren't funded at all by any of the private income. The government income. They're completely funded by the private income. So you are able to look at options there of furloughing staff and ultimately claiming the funding. And I think the key piece around that is really just in terms of the documentation of it, and you know, the guidance has set out you know, the processes that you should follow, you know, those key questions that you should be answering yourself about whether you can furlough that particular person, and then coming down to how you will actually calculate a claim for those people that you do furlough. I know, again, where I'm a trustee, we have furloughed some staff. That's been through an in-house catering provision, and some staff and aftercare staff as well. We've gone through the process. We've fully documented all our considerations, how we've arrived at that decision.
Brilliant. And Simon, have you got any thoughts around sort of what you've been doing, or any decisions that you've had to come to around sort of the financial support at CAT?
I think it's interesting that the furlough question in a school is very much a moral question, I think, and Andy's just kind of touched on that. So at board level, we did have a debate. We haven't got any trades or subsidiaries, so it's quite difficult for us to ring fence specific people and specific individuals. So kind of morally at trustee level, we haven't pressed the button actually on furloughing anybody, but what we have done is kind of redeployed members of the various teams. So the leisure facility example that I gave earlier on, to get us through kind of the Easter holidays and the forthcoming half term, what we've done is looked at the staff there and actually utilise them to help with activities through the school holidays, with the school being open for vulnerable children and children of key workers. So we've kind of included those individuals within our rota system to keep them in work, but we haven't at this point decided to do anything with furlough, which has mainly been as a result of more of a moral considerations than a financial one, really. But I think it is quite a tricky area, and I know we've had a number of clients asking us, haven't we, about the legality and the appropriateness of using furlough, given that there is public funding flowing in. So I think with anything in this, you know, I've been saying to clients and to my trustees, document the thought process, go through the rules and regulations, understand why you're making the decisions that you're doing, and at trustee level, get it minuted. And at least then, if ever there was a challenge, we've always got that first line of defence of, we've considered the guidance that was out there, we've met as a group, and we've documented a decision, which I think will stand you in good stead throughout all of this decision making that we're having to do at the moment, really.
Brilliant.
The documentation.
Oh, sorry, Karen.
No, I was just going to really just sort of emphasise something Simon said. You know, the documentation, I think, is critical, because what we've seen in terms of helping clients across the rest of the business with a lot of their CJRS claims is that the sort of checking at the moment from HMRC is fairly high level. You know, they're not getting into the detail of checking your calculations. They're maybe asking you a few straightforward or slightly random questions. But what the DfE have said is that they, you know, will reserve the right to check these claims in detail at a later date. So, you know, I expect there will be some scrutiny, particularly on academies that have claimed any CJRS funding in the future. And I know from our perspective as auditors, you know, that may will be a focus area for us as well come year-end audit. So the documentation is critical.
Yeah. I could pick up on a couple of those points, really. I think really, if schools and academies are kind of employing good governance and, you know, good best practice in terms of documenting their decisions, evaluating them, you know, if you continue to do that kind of thing in the current circumstances, you're not going to be doing anything wrong. I think the other thing to bear in mind was, I just kind of wanted to pick up on was, you know, Andy was talking about the exceptional costs funding, and the point about if you're not adding to reserves this current year, you can claim for it. Again, to me, that just really underscores the importance of kind of having good financial management in place to start with, because, you kind of need to know, are you going to be, you know, maybe before this all hit, were you going to be adding to your reserves? Because then you've kind of got a baseline to evaluate what the impact has been. So really, you know, although these are really challenging times and there's a lot of uncertainty, I think if you know, good practice will stand you in good stead in all of this. So I'd encourage, you know, everybody both from an internal scrutiny point of view, but also, you know, when Andy comes to, you know, and the audit teams come in to be doing people's audits, they're going to be looking for evidence of the fact that we've considered these things, really. So, because there is a lot of new and different stuff and difficult decisions to be made ultimately.
Yeah, agreed. And I think just picking up on the kind of the year-end process and reporting, you know, there is going to be a requirement in annual accounts at the year-end audit to be reviewing, as we always do, the year. So the year to the 31st of August 2020, you know, is going to be an unusual year for trustee reports, isn't it? So I think, you know, we need to be capturing all of this and the changes and documenting it, so that actually when we come to write that trustees report, we've got some detail there as to how decision making has potentially changed, some of the levers that we've pulled, changes to risk management processes, etc. So they are captured in that kind of review of the year, really, when we come to the statutory accounts process.
Thank you very much. I mean, the good thing about that whole little piece there was the telepathy was working, because every time I wanted to ask a question, it was being answered. So that anyone would think we would know what we were talking about, but I'll let you reserve judgment on that. We've had another sort of great question in which I'd like to throw open to the floor, and that's: do you think there is a risk of that if an academy trust does not open the school when the government wants them to, it will impact on the evaluation of their exceptional funding claims?
I'm happy to say that one. I mean, I wouldn't have thought so, because ultimately the decision as to whether, you know, whether to open the school, it's the governors, and in an academy trust, it's the directors, the trustees. You know, that's my understanding legally. That's where the ultimate responsibility lies. You know, the government's guidance may be that they want schools to do that, but ultimately the decision is down to the directors based on all the evidence, risk assessment, and everything. Do they feel it's you know, safe for everyone, pupils and staff, to open? So I think, you know, to then, if they didn't, having gone through that process for their particular school or trust, or say, you know, we're not doing it 1st of June, we may do it later or slightly more phased. I think that's quite different from the exceptional costs, because the exceptional costs will be very tangible and able to be demonstrated that an academy has incurred, and be able to claim the funding for it. And I think it's quite a separate decision. Just because an academy doesn't open, or a school doesn't open from 1st of June, you know, I don't think there's any implication that, well, you're going to be better off financially. It's, you know, largely it probably won't make a lot of difference. If anything, actually opening may have more of an impact, because of all things like deep cleaning, you know, sites that have been slightly, you know, aspects of sites that have been slightly cotton balled for a few months, you know, those got to be reopened, deep cleaned. Are they safe? Are they prepared? Everything like that. So if anything, there could be more costs associated with schools reopening than not.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I don't know, you can get very cynical about things like this, but I'd like to think that they wouldn't be linked, those two decisions, and ultimately,
yeah.
You know, it comes down to our role as trustees or governors and senior leaders in school, in terms of, you know, robustly risk assessing what the situation is in our school or in the individual schools, and then coming to a decision as to whether we can safely operate, or under what conditions we can safely operate. So I would like to, as Andy says, I mean, if you don't open, presumably there'll be less costs at some point, but or for the time being. But I would like to think they wouldn't couple those together. It would seem really unfair if they did.
Thank you very much for that. So in terms of the financial support, then just quickly recapping that. So we've obviously spoken about sort of the furlough scheme, the scrutiny that currently is in terms of the light touch from the HMRC and what that could possibly form into, certainly as part of the year-end process. And then we've touched on those exceptional costs then from obviously the guidance and sort of that risk management point of view. I think the one thing though that we haven't touched on, I know there was an update yesterday and things. So Andy, I'd just like your thoughts on kind of the key considerations on sort of the procurement policy notice. I know that we could do a whole webinar separately on this, but it'd be good just to get your thoughts on sort of the overview and the summary piece of that, if that's at all possible.
Okay, yeah, in a nutshell, because you're right, you know, it's it's quite a complicated area, and it's one where the guidance has continued to be extra guidance released, and then very recently there's been some very specific guidance on that released for state-funded schools and academies. So, you know, I don't think the recent guidance for schools and academies, I don't think it really changed the principles of what was there before, which was really, you know, working with your suppliers, open book arrangement, you know, assessing, you know, whether they're a critical supplier, whether they're financially at risk, and then based on an open book arrangement with them, working out, well, what's the best way to continue? Are your suppliers critical? Do we need them? Have we pre-booked them? Things like that, and then working with them as to what sort of commercial or financial sort of interventions you need to introduce as a result of that. And again, I think the key there is just making sure you engage in that process with suppliers. You know, we have had quite a few questions from clients around that, and particularly around, you know, are some of the proposals that suppliers have put forward to them, are they reasonable? And that's been around catering, you know, where catering is outsourced, you know, continuing to pay caterers just for sort of the underlying cost element of their operation. And I think what's come clear from some of those questions that we've had is that, you know, you really need to be talking to those suppliers about, well, what other sources of funding or government support during the coronavirus crisis are you accessing? You know, if you're furloughing staff, or you're accessing small business grants or the larger business grants, you know, those should be the first avenues before then, you know, looking at how you implement the PPN in those situations. So, you know, a complicated area, but that's yeah, kind of a nutshell. I mean, if anyone has really specific questions, then you know, happy to take those offline and deal with those.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And then we've had another sort of great question in. So as a school that's forecasted a deficit this year, we've worked extremely hard to now be forecasting a surplus. We've had close ESFA scrutiny, and they've required us to increase our reserves from a lowly 40,000 last year. I feel we should be allowed to make exceptional funding claims so that we can still achieve what has been asked of us. And again, it's just an open question to the floor on what your thoughts are around this particular scenario.
Well, I think, yeah, no, absolutely. You know, I mean, what's interesting in the guidance is that it refers to adding to your reserves in the 2020 financial year, and it kind of clarifies that in terms of, you know, for maintained schools that's April to March financial year, and for academies it's the September to August year. So I think, although it's about the exceptional costs you're incurring now, you know, through staying open through the Easter and summer holiday period, the free school meals, the funding will be claimed in the 2020-21 year. So again, it's, well, what's the impact in your 2020-21 year? So it's going to come down to, well, what is the realistic sort of plan and scenario for you for that year, and that'll come down to your budget exercise this year. I think there's more guidance to come out about this scheme in terms of the actual mechanics of how it will work and claiming the funding. So in the case that was highlighted, if you really are going to add to your reserves next year because you've obviously had to do a lot of work at the direction of the SFA to try and build the reserves and restructure the school, then on the black and white reading of the guidance, yes, that would appear to preclude you. But I think, as ever, the caveat I saw, or the loophole, or the shoots of optimism in there, is that if you have exceptional cases, then contact the SFA and work through those. So I think if you could show that, well, we're expecting a surplus next year, but actually the cost that we've incurred is actually going to mean that we're not starting that year with a stronger financial position as we would have, then for me, I would think that that's not an unreasonable case to be asking to be able to claim some of that funding. But hopefully some more guidance later might clarify some of that.
Yeah, I'd agree, and I think it highlights the importance, doesn't it, of making sure that actually you're segregating and capturing all of this exceptional cost separately. Whether that's on a nominal ledger code or in a separate workbook or whatever. Make sure that we're absolutely ring fencing this, so that in the fullness of time, if you do need to go to the SFA with an exceptional case, you've got all of the supporting documentation and records and thought and logic that's gone behind that, really.
Yeah, it could be useful to have a separate cost centre, for example, in your finance system, where you book all of those costs and then it's easier to track. I mean, I think personally, I'd have a lot of sympathy with you in your specific case where you've had to work really hard to turn things around. I'd say give it a go. That's what I would do. Talk. If you've got contacts at the ESFA, you said you've been working closely with the ESFA. I would leverage those relationships and try and make an argument for why this has kind of come out of the blue, and it's you're already trying to turn things around. So I would be personally arguing quite strongly for exceptional circumstances, and I mean, if you don't try, you're not going to get it, are you? So it's worth a go.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much all on that answer. And I think just in terms of our third piece of this webinar, just as time is pressing, I wanted to pass the floor to Simon. Obviously, we've been able to get his thoughts on specific bits and pieces throughout, but just in terms of obviously the governance aspect of sitting as a chair of trustee, going through COVID-19, and I'd just really like to hear about sort of your experiences of that, and just some of the things that you've had to do differently to keep up with obviously all the guidance, to ensure that things are still running effectively, and just to share those experiences really.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I'll just literally spend a couple of minutes just talking through how we've changed our governance structure at CAT to be able to, as a board of trustees, really move quite quickly in this changing landscape. So I think all that's been highlighted today really is the importance, as ever really, of really strong governance. And I think this coronavirus pandemic and schools being closed has really heightened that, actually. As trustees, and I know we've got a few trustees listening in today, really, your responsibilities are, as they've always been really, as a board of trustees for the operation of the schools, but this situation that we find ourselves in has probably heightened that. So one of the very first things we did at Community Academy Trust was to temporarily suspend our local governing bodies. Now, I know, talking to chairs at a number of other MATs, we weren't alone in doing that. A good number of organisations thanked their LGBs very much for everything that they'd done up to the point of lockdown, and then said, actually, we're going to stand you down as a subcommittee of the main trust board and just take control of this really as a smaller group of people. And that was done in our instance to make sure that our governance was pretty agile and able to move very quickly. So we looked at our schemes of delegation, and again, you know, we'll be coming up to external audit. We will be looking as auditors around how schemes of delegation have worked. And at CAT, we looked very closely at our schemes of delegation and immediately moved a lot of the delegated powers that were given to our LGB to our executive team, so to our CEO, our FD, and their immediate team, and said, actually, you are now directly responsible for a whole raft of things that the LGBs used to be responsible for, and then we as a group of trustees would monitor that. That actually enabled us to move quite quickly, really, and ensure consistency across our whole trust with what we were doing in the areas of lockdown and opening up to children of key workers and vulnerable children as well. There was a question, and I've been asked this by clients, and I was asked it by my fellow trustees as well, around liability. And actually, you know, does this change of delegation mean an increased liability for trustees? My personal view on that is the answer is no, nothing has changed. As trustees of a multi-academy trust, we are ultimately responsible for everything that goes on in that trust, and this is no different. So I think liability rests with the Board of Trustees, as it always has done. And again, my own view is follow the guidance, document the thought process, amend your risk assessment and risk management procedures, make sure you've got clear conclusions documented in your board minutes, and kind of carry on, really. And that's what we've done as the Board of Trustees. We've actually met more frequently than we were going to do, because we are governing in some detail, actually, our 17 sites now, and we've completely changed the data that we get as a trustee body from our CEO and from our schools. So focusing really on very key areas around the health and well-being of our staff and their availability to work, which has become especially important now as we move towards this key date of opening more widely from, and you know, I emphasise the word from, the 1st of June. So we're trying to get a real handle on, you know, how widely our staff are available to do that. We've then been looking school by school at pupil engagement, so how many pupils have been engaged with remote learning and then meaningful remote learning, and how effective the lockdown curriculum delivery has been. And then we've also been looking at safeguarding. But one of the key things that we've brought in is this concept of a decision log. So we've asked every head teacher in all of our schools to record very carefully any exceptional decisions that they've been making, and the sign-off procedures through our executive leadership team, which we have then been reviewing and ratifying as a trustee board. So we've made sure that we've maintained really that audit trail around decision making, which again links back to the issue of liability. We've got a clear audit thread and an audit trail as to who's empowered to make the decisions and actually who's signing off on those decisions. So that decision log for some of our schools in our trust has been quite light, but for others has been pretty lengthy, actually. But we know as a trustee board at every step in this journey who's been making decision and who's been signing off. We've also just ramped up the work of our audit committee, which is back to one of Sarah's points really around risk management, and just kind of, none of us, I imagine, in our risk registers had worldwide pandemic. So we've now just been updating our risk registers and risk management processes to make sure that we've captured all of that. So for me, as a chair of a MAP board, I think, you know, the responsibility does sit quite heavily on all of us that are trustees and governors, and actually, you know, the staff in our schools. But I think the importance of clear communication and clear documentation and tracking a different set of KPIs, actually, I think as a trustee body, we're much more in the detail than we perhaps would have been ordinarily, but for a period of time, until we switch our local governing bodies back on, we need to be. We've been keeping our LGBs close to us with regular updates. We had a board meeting yesterday, and one of my jobs for this afternoon is to pen a note to all the chairs of my LGBs just by way of our thoughts for the 1st of June and what we're doing in terms of monitoring the activities in their schools, so that when we're ready to bring them back, they kind of hit the ground running and feel informed and included, really. So yeah, that's just a snapshot in a few minutes of the changes that we've made at CAT, really.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Simon. And obviously, we're sort of 6 or so minutes left. I think the one thing that we've just touched around the edges of throughout the webinar, and it's clearly all of our comfort zones, and that's just sort of year-end audit. And it was just really just to get your thoughts on from some of the guidance and stuff that has come out, just how that may affect auditing in the first term of the next financial year.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think the first thing to note actually is, Eileen Milner and the ASFA stance at the moment that the deadline is the deadline. So at the moment, there doesn't seem to be any desire or give on that 31st of December deadline for the account. So I think we all need to head into this knowing actually that we need to find a way through whatever, certainly from the 1st of September looks like, in terms of getting prepared for the external audit, which at the moment needs to be completed in accordance with the usual deadlines that we're working to.
Yeah, so I think naturally that's going to involve a lot of the work, if not possibly even all of the work, being done remotely. So that's an aspect we've been doing across the rest of the firm already anyway on non-academy clients. So we're very used to and very geared up for doing that. I think the other aspect will come in is in terms of, well, how this is all reported in trustees' reports. There's going to be a lot of considerations in trustees' reports about what the impact is, reporting on KPIs, just general disclosure about it all, disclosures of exceptional costs, disclosures of any funding claimed. And in terms of our audit as well, that those areas will be areas that we have to look at and focus on during the year-end audit as well. So that'll be something that we're trying to cover off quite early on in the piece as well. I think as well, hopefully the ESFA, when they publish the AFH, it's due to be published by the end of May, and discussions I've had with the ESFA, that's still the date they're working to, by the end of May, I think is the wording they used. And when the AAD comes out as well, there may be some more clarity around, particularly in terms of disclosure, but possibly focus areas as well, particularly around regularity and proprietary, those sorts of issues. So I think when those documents come out, we might see a little more guidance and emphasis that we'll certainly look at and decipher for you then as well.
Brilliant. And obviously for the shameless plug, just to finish off with, we will be running a separate webinar with Eatsball at the end of July that covers that in more detail, and that will be the last couple of weeks of July. So I think if there aren't any more questions, any that sort of come through in the next couple of minutes, we will ensure that we take offline and answer for you. It's just really to say thank you very much for your time this morning. It's been a great talk with everyone, and hopefully you've enjoyed it and got something out of it. And just sort of recapping, we wanted to obviously talk around sort of the COVID-19 guidance in specific to financial parts for the education sector, and I think Andy sort of covered that off with sort of the two aspects around sort of the control and then the financial support. We've also sort of touched on governance, and have got Simon's expertise there around his role in the chair of trustees for CAT, and just how he's lived through the COVID-19 experience. And finally then, in terms of sort of the day-to-day running of the schools, the things that are going on this term, and what sort of risk management in terms of scrutiny has looked like, and Sarah has been able to discuss this. So hopefully we've fulfilled sort of the objectives of our webinar, and as I say, I will pass it round the room, a bit of sort of celebrity squares with arrows and such like, just so that everyone can provide their final thoughts and say goodbye themselves. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks everyone. I hope we've helped. But if you have got questions or things that come to you after this, just get in touch. You can get in touch with us through the website or LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter, but I'm not very good on Twitter. I'm a bit of a newbie there. So, but you can find us. You can find us easily.
Yeah, equally, thanks everyone. I hope you've found it helpful and informative. And as Sarah said, you can find us on the website, on the original e-shot that you got with this invitation, or on LinkedIn. I'm not on Twitter at all, but yeah, LinkedIn or email. Great. Have a great day, everyone.
Great, and thanks all for tuning in from me. It's been a really good hour. I think we could probably have talked for another hour. There's plenty going on in this field, but as everybody said, if you do need anything, we'll take the questions that we haven't managed to answer offline and get back to individuals. And yes, track us down on the website or LinkedIn or drop us an email directly. It would be great to talk and great to help you through this time. And stay safe. And I hope all of those working in schools manage to get some sort of well-deserved rest over the coming half term. So take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.